Hello guys, welcome to Offerspill's coverage of Norway chess. I'm going to take a look at Magnus Carlsen's first round encounter with Levon Aronian from Armenia. Magnus played with the black pieces against the very dynamic and aggressive Armenian grandmaster, so we'll take a look at this. The classical game between the players ended in a draw, and we'll also have a look at the tiebreaker in the next video, where Magnus actually managed to trick Aronian after a long struggle. Okay, Aronian, a very flexible player, can play many different opening moves. For example, these four, but he did go for d4 in this game. Magnus answering with knight f6, c4, e6, and some invitation to the Queen's Indian from Aronian. Maybe even the Bogo Indian if Magnus goes for this, or the Queen's Indian as mentioned, but it is a Queen's Gambit on the board. Knight c3, bishop b4. Suddenly we get some Ragozin kind of position. Usually you don't want to exchange this this bishop against the knight, but the pin is useful for black in the opening stages of the game. e3 castles. And now some slightly curious move from Aronian, bishop d2, just breaking the pin immediately and getting the position out of at least the most well-known theoretical waters early on, which could be a good strategy against the world champion. b6 from Magnus. Of course, this is a big decision where to put your pieces, right? I mean, do you want to exchange these pawns off? Do you want to go for c5? Do you want to go for the e5 break maybe? There's a lot of different moves to consider here. Magnus chooses, I guess, the most natural move, just continue development and find the most appropriate place to put your light squared bishop, which is b7. cd, ed from Aronian, a very well-known tactic or method when faced with the b6 move. Very often you'd like your opponent to get the bishop on b7 and only to be stuck behind your own pawn on d5. So if Magnus plays bishop b7 now, the bishop wouldn't be very active there in the fianchettoed position if it preferred to be on this diagonal. But then again, you would have played b6 to no use. So this is Aronian's point. Rook c1, rook e8, getting some more central control. Bishop d3. Time to finish development for white as well. And now a very nice move from Magnus, who waited a couple of moves to do this. Bishop a6, exchanging these bishops off, as this is the best bishop white has. The bishop on d2 is of course solid and defensively quite helpful, but it is stuck behind the central pawns and the pawn chain. So this is definitely the bishop you want with black to exchange, while you want or you would prefer white to be stuck with this. This is why Magnus did not play bishop a6 here at the earliest convenience, because Aronian would save himself from playing bishop d3 immediately. He would actually save a tempo by being able to exchange this off immediately. So Magnus instead plays a useful move, rook e8, and forces Aronian to finish development, for only then to bother him with bishop a6. So very nice maneuver from Magnus. Takes, and castles, and now bishop f8. As we said earlier in the video, Magnus or many other players in these kinds of structures would prefer to keep this bishop, as it has slightly more mobility, because the pawn on d5, the central pawn for black, is on a white square, and you don't want to exchange it off against the knight on c3, at least not without any good reason, because that would just free up white's position. So bishop f8, knight e2 from Aronian, queen c8 from Magnus, which is a slightly curious move, but you want to place it on b7, where it's fianchettoed, but also supporting the knight, and of course supporting the center and the c5 break, which is Magnus's plan. And he does that actually in the very next move, c5. Knight g3 and queen b7. This might look like a weird constellation of pieces, but the knight actually would prefer to be placed on e6. This is the perfect placement of the knight in these kind of fianchetto structures. So if you play some Queen's Gambit, Tartakover variation, which this might resemble. Then the knight going to a6, c7, and e6 is a very well known maneuver played in many games by, for example, Nigel Short, which is who's one of the experts in this line. DC, and now big decision from Magnus: how to recapture, which piece to recapture with. You want to exchange with the pawn, or do you want to activate your bishop? I mean, the bishop is not super active on c5. It doesn't do much here, and it's more safe to keep this on f8. If you do bc5, then you get the hanging pawns, which is a very demanding and very strategic pawn structure. Could be nice for black, but very often this structure you would prefer to not exchange too many pieces. And after exchanging a bishop here in this kind of position, Magnus instead chooses a different kind of pawn structure. He doesn't want to deal with the hanging pawns right now. He wants to activate his knight and gain control over these two squares, which are quite crucial in this kind of structure. White, on the other hand, has very nice control over d4, so if white is able to stabilize and maneuver in this kind of position, it could get quite uncomfortable for black, as this pawn might get a bit weak. Practical tip from me, guys: don't exchange too many pieces in these kind of pawn structures with black, as the d5 pawn, the isolated queen's pawn, would get quite weak. It actually gets weaker by every exchange. So don't do that unless you have a very good reason to. Rook a c8 for Magnus, just activating his pieces, kicking the queen away, and then bringing his knight into the fold, knight fe4. So very logical to do this with the f knight and not the c5 knight, because here you would have one active knight. Here we have two, so why not? Bishop e1, and now g6 from Magnus, fianchettoing his bishop and keeping the g3 knight away. That's very nice. Knight e2 from Aronian, again trying to maneuver and maybe put some pressure on the d5 pawn. Knight a4 from Magnus. This is a very demanding pawn structure. You would need to be on your toes with black to be able to, well, not nullify, but at least keep white at an arm's length in this position, because if white's able to pile up the pressure against the d5 pawn, it's not going to be much fun for black. Of course, Magnus is experienced in this pawn structure and knows what to do. He tries to force some concession on the queen side. Aronian doesn't want to do this. Of course, if b3, then there's a lot of black squares available for Magnus, and maybe even knight b2 is a move as well. So rook b1, bishop g7 again, looking at this pawn on b2, and the knight circles back to c5 when the job is done. So with the knight on d4, it looks very nice, but it also blocks for the pressure on d5, so it's not really contributing to much, the knight on d4, because Magnus has everything covered. The b5 square, the f5 square is not available for the knight on d4, so it's a very pretty piece, but it doesn't do much. And it goes back to f3, knight e6, to the ideal square for the knight in this position, where it controls very important squares, and even helps to maybe push the pawn to d4 and exchange it off at some point. Knight d4, some exchange, which of course is okay for Magnus, as if you have two knights in these kinds of structures, they very often tend to want to occupy the same kind of squares. So I was just thinking about where to put this knight. Maybe to c5 and then e6 now to exchange this one off. Here we have two knights wanting to occupy the same kind of square. So Magnus knows that in this kind of pawn structure you shouldn't exchange too many pieces, but of course there are exceptions to the rule, and he goes for the exchange. And then rook c4, and just trying to get some pressure on the c file. b3, rook c7, mission accomplished, Another weakening move from white, and the c3 square is suddenly a bit weak. Queen d3, knight c5, and we get a repetition of moves quite early in the game, but the players decided enough is enough, and they headed to tie breaks. A pretty solid affair for Magnus in his first classical game in the Norway chess tournament against Levon Aronian, who quite often is a difficult opponent for Magnus. So a draw with black in the first game is solid, and we'll take a look at how he did in the playoff game against the Aronian in the next video.